Hi, everyone, and welcome to my second attempt to record the short story The Stranger by George I. Mavrodes. This is the second time I'm trying to do this because the first time there was some problems with my microphone. Anyway, I listened to it and I did not like what I heard, so I decided to try again. Also, just a quick note, I have something in the oven, so at one point I'm going to actually have to pause the recording and go take care of it. So apologies in advance for the interruption, which I anticipate. I have a lot on my plate today, and this was the only way to get everything done. So just a little bit of background. The Stranger was written either in 1983 or 1984. I see conflicting reports as to when this book was published. But it's a short story that is an attempt to teach a philosophical lesson. The story comes from a collection of essays on modern views on God's existence. It was edited by Alvin Plantinga, the Calvinist philosopher, and Nicholas Wolterstorff. My professor back in 2006, when I was a student, a grad student at Concordia University in Montreal, Dr. Paul Allen, assigned me one of the essays from this book. I believe it was one by Wolterstorff. Anyway, it was an interesting essay. I enjoyed what I read, and I also decided to flip through the book and see what else there was in addition to what I had been assigned. And I was really surprised to learn that one of the articles, these are all like philosophical academic papers, right? One of the articles was a short story, and you don't see that too often in academia, so I was intrigued. So I read the story, and 19 years later, I still remember it. I also was a little bit puzzled by the story. I wasn't 100% sure what the author was saying. That's one of the problems with writing in story form is that the point you're trying to make, the lesson or your conclusion, is not always obvious. On the other hand, maybe that's not a problem because this story, it stayed with me for 19 years. And if it had just been a regular academic paper, maybe I wouldn't remember it. So maybe there are advantages to telling stories after all. I say again and again that Plato used storytelling to great effect throughout his writing. Stories like the myth of the cave, the story of the Ring of Gyges, both of those come from the Republic, and there are many other examples from Plato's writing as well, show that using stories to teach philosophical lessons is actually really effective. So perhaps the author of this story was onto something. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to read to you The Stranger by George I. Mavrodes, written between 1983 and 1984, or maybe it was written before that, but that's when it was published. Also, I just want to point out that I found a PDF online of the entire book, and the quality is not the best. So one of the reasons I'm actually reading this story to you is to sort of help you in case things aren't immediately obvious. So I hope that this helps, and I also hope this is a good recording, because my last one was really, really bad. Anyway, let's get started. The Stranger by George I. Mavrodes. Carol Ten Boom's conscience still troubled her as she settled herself into the airliner's seat and looked over the wing towards Chicago's O'Hare terminal. I really should have witnessed to her, she thought to herself. At least I could have said I was a Christian, or something. She was thinking of the girl with the long skirt, braided hair, and gigantic handbag who had offered her a flower in the terminal. A Mooni, she supposed, or maybe a Hare Krishna. Moonis and Hare Krishnas were religious sects that got started in the 60s and 70s. I don't want to call them cults exactly. They were more fringe religious movements. Anyway, they used to hang out in airports and try to like recruit people. So this girl that Carol has seen is one of these people. But she would let me start over. A Mooni, she supposed, or maybe a Hare Krishna. But she had simply mumbled, "No, thank you," and hurried on, unwilling to be trapped into the persevering conversation she knew would follow. But now she wondered, as she often did these days, whether she should have gathered her courage to say something about Christ. Had she really denied him after all by saying nothing? These reflections about the past, however, were soon swallowed up by a more current problem, for as passengers came down the aisle, looking from their ticket envelopes to the seat numbers, so this is in the days before cell phones, right? People had paper tickets on airplanes. I'm old enough that I remember back when it was like that. Yeah, looking from their ticket envelopes to the seat numbers, one man caught her attention. And no wonder. His dark face was made even darker by his billowing white shirt and the pleated, folded white cotton trousers. A fringe of black hair showed beneath his turban, a convoluted knot of fabric, maroon and gray. And his eyes scanned the numbers on the overhead baggage racks, and as his eyes scanned the numbers on the overhead baggage racks, a premonition seized Carol's heart. Her premonition was true. As she had somehow known he would, the dark man took the seat beside her. He pushed his briefcase under the seat in front and awkwardly pulled the belt buckle from beneath him. Maybe he smiled at her, but Carol didn't turn to see. A voice was coming over the intercom now, while the stewardess stood in front, dangling a yellow mask from her hand. Carol heard the voice in snatches. Extinguish all smoking materials. So this is back in the days when you could smoke on an airplane. Yeah, though I'm not even old enough to remember that. Extinguish all smoking materials and pull the mask toward you, placing it over your nose and but though she was only a college senior, Carol had already heard that message many times. She had never seen the masks fall from their overhead compartments, and did not really think she ever would. Nor would she ever use the lower seat cushion as a flotation device. The announcement meant no more to her now than the sound of the engines, or the thrust against her back as the plane gathered speed on the runway. He's an Indian, of course, she thought, a Hindu, or maybe a Buddhist. Or were there any Indian Buddhists? Some religion had died out in India, but she couldn't remember which one. And how did one witness to a Hindu or a Buddhist? She had vowed, or was it really a vow, that she would try to witness to whomever sat beside her. What if he asked her about karma, or whether she had read the holy books of India? What if he couldn't speak English at all? Maybe that would be lucky, and then she was ashamed for thinking such a thing. And so she opened the book which she had brought along. There was still plenty of time, she thought, hours before they landed in San Francisco. Maybe it would be natural to say something when they were eating. Maybe he could see her bow her head and pray and then ask her about it. And so she read for a while, but the book was difficult. The Nature of Necessity. And by the way, that book, The Nature of Necessity, is actually written by one of the editors of this book, Alvin Plantinga, the Calvinist philosopher. He's an interesting guy. I've read some of his things. So she read for a while. The book was difficult, The Nature of Necessity, and she couldn't concentrate enough to make any real headway in it. And then she glanced to her left, involuntarily, or so it seemed, and her eyes met those of her dark neighbor, and for a moment both of them were embarrassed. I say, I'm sorry, the man said. I didn't mean to stare, but one doesn't often see someone reading philosophy in an airliner. The incongruity between what Carol had expected and the precise British accents which she actually heard left her speechless. She looked down at her book and then at the man again, managing a smile. You must be a university student, he said. Well, yes, she said. A college student, I mean. I go to Calvin College in Michigan. Calvin College? I haven't heard of it. Is it named for John Calvin, the reformer? Yes, she said. It's a Christian college. A Christian college, the Indian said, smiling. I say, that's splendid. Then you must be a Christian. I'm a Christian, too. You are? Carol could not keep the surprise from her voice. Yes, he said. I was baptized almost 6 years ago. It was not long before I left for England. That's wonderful, Carol said. She would have liked to ask him how he became to be a Christian, an adult convert, it seemed. But maybe that would seem to be prying, and he said no more about it for the moment. You must really like philosophy, he said, nodding at her book. Oh, I do, Carol said, brightening up. She really was enthusiastic about philosophy, and not at all reluctant in discussion. I'm majoring in it at Calvin, and next year I hope to begin graduate work. I've applied to Yale, the University of Michigan, Cornell, and UCLA. I say, that's really good. I'm awfully keen on philosophy myself. I read greats at Oxford, mostly philosophy, and But I haven't introduced myself. I'm Ravi Gupta. Just call me Ravi. I'm Carol, she said. Carol ten Boom. It's a Dutch name. My grandparents came from the old country. I'm glad to meet you. What are you most interested in philosophy? He asked her. Oh, almost everything, but epistemology especially, and philosophy of religion. Epistemology, parenthetical note, epistemology is the study of knowledge and how we learn, right? How the things in the world outside of us come to be constructed or understood by the minds inside of us. Really, he said, I'm most interested in philosophy of religion too. I suppose it's because of the way I came to believe in Jesus. Oh, how is that? It was because of an argument, he went on. I understand that not many people come that way anymore, but maybe even stranger, it was an argument that I myself constructed. Really? Yeah, I was only 20 at the time, and I hadn't studied much philosophy yet, so it was really crude and rough in spots. But it was on the right track, I'm sure of it. I became convinced that the religion of Jesus Christ is the true way of salvation. So I found some Christians in Madras and was baptized, and I have worshipped God in the Christian way ever since then. That's really strange, Carol said. I don't think I've ever heard of anyone being converted by an argument. I thought it wasn't even possible. I thought only the Holy Spirit could lead someone to Christ. Of course, I don't mean that the Holy Spirit wasn't in it, Ravi replied. I'm sure that God did lead me by his Spirit. I've often heard Christians say that the Spirit works through sermons, through the Bible, and so on. In my case, he worked through an argument. But the theistic arguments aren't any good, are they? Said Carol. I mean, they're not sound. Was your argument like the standard arguments in the textbooks? Well, not exactly. It was part. It has a part that is rather like Thomas's argument from causality, and a part that is pretty clearly a version of the teleological argument. But overall, I haven't seen anything very close to it in the history of philosophy. And those of you who have taken this class with me know that the causality argument from Thomas is the same argument put forward by Aristotle in the Metaphysics. St. Thomas Aquinas simply took Aristotle's argument and gave it new life 1,500 years later. Um, so yes, his argument is rather like Thomas's argument, but overall he hasn't seen anything close to it in the history of philosophy. And do you still think it's sound? Oh, absolutely, he said. I told you it was pretty crude when I first worked on it. There was some modal mistakes in it, and other mistakes, but it was basically right. And this past year at Oxford, I've reworked the whole thing. I've put it into a rigorous form, and now it is a strict demonstration that Christianity is the true religion. Carol's hesitancy had disappeared by now. They were talking philosophy, and she was confident in that. She wasn't a PhD, but she wasn't a neophyte either, and she had no reluctance to plunge into the discussion. And at that point, my alarm has gone off, so I will pause this recording, take care of my banana bread, and then I will return to this recording. Won't be long. And I am back. So where was I? She wasn't a PhD, but she wasn't a neophyte either, and she had no reluctance to plunge in demonstration, she said. What do you mean by a demonstration? And then hearing the words herself, she blushed and said, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sound like a professor. Perfectly all right, said Ravi. It's exactly the right thing to ask. By demonstration of P, I mean a deductively valid argument which has P for its conclusion, and such that each premise is either incorrigible or self-evident or evident to the senses. All right, so there's actually a number of things to discuss in this paragraph. First of all, by a demonstration of P, he means to prove that P is the case, right? So P is the conclusion. P is just a letter we use for any statement that we're trying to prove. So P could be the sky is blue, for example, all right? Or 2 plus 2 is 4, okay? Just any statement is represented by the letter P. Usually the letter is in italics, and the first time I reread this, it threw me off because I wasn't sure what P meant, but P is just the statement he's trying to prove. So in this particular case, it's that Christianity is the one true religion. Okay, because it's a demonstration that Christianity is the one true religion. So P represents Christianity is the one true religion. Okay, hopefully that's clear. Okay, there are a couple of other things here too. First, he wants to show that each premise is either incorrigible or self-evident or evident to the senses. So each step of the argument is either incorrigible. Incorrigible is when something is immediately known to be true by you, okay? And you don't need evidence to know that it's true. A good example, I'm hungry, all right? When I'm hungry, I know I'm hungry. I just know it. I don't need to think about it. I don't need to prove it. I don't need to look for evidence that I'm hungry. I just know that I'm hungry. That's an incorrigible statement. So each premise is either obviously true or self-evident, and that is when you see that it's true, though it might take a moment to think about it. But everything that you see is known to be true automatically. And a good example of something that is self-evident is simple math, okay? I've got 2 apples, 2 red apples. I've got 3 green apples. And on the other side of the equal sign, I have three green apples and two red apples. It's the same number of apples, the same apples. But look how this is written. It's written as if 2 plus 3 equals 5. But this is a self-evident preposition if I realize, if I sort of pretend that the plus sign isn't there, I simply have the same thing on both sides of the equal sign. All right, so if I really look at it, what's on one side of the equal sign over here is exactly the same as what's on the other side of the equal sign over here. It's just that what's on the left side of the equal sign is divided up into two steps. Step 1, step 2, conclusion. All right, but it's the same. So if I just take a moment to think about it, I see that it's true. Another good example of a self-evident proposition comes from, oh, it's not loading up. Oh, there it is. Okay, our good friend René Descartes and his famous phrase, I think, therefore I am. So Descartes realized that he existed because he was trying to decide what he could not doubt, and he decided to doubt everything, right? Including the fact that he's sitting in the room right now. Because what if he's dreaming, right? So he decided to doubt everything, and then tried to find one thing that he could not doubt, and that thing was his own existence, because you can't doubt that. It's not possible. So he realized that he thinks, and that if he thinks, then he must exist. That's a self-evident proposition. He can't deny it after thinking about it, because that's a self-evident proposition. And finally, there are statements that are evident to the senses, and a good example of this would be the sky is blue. And I know the sky is blue because I looked at the sky and I saw that it was blue. However, in the evening, the sky will not be blue because the sunset will change the color of the sky. Okay, so the senses tell me whether or not a particular thing is true, and that's subject to change because, the world's always changing. So these sorts of statements are not 100% infallible or reliable, and they're subject to the situation. So there are three different kinds of arguments here. Some of them are incorrigible, immediately known to be true, self-evident, which are like logically true. You have to think about it for a second, but it's logically true. And then third, dependent on what you see and know about the world. Okay, so all of our statements about the truth come from things that are one of those three things. All right, so getting back. I'm going to read that again now, just because I just went off and explained like this is like a 4-line paragraph, and I spent a lot of time talking about it. Perfectly all right, said Ravi. It's exactly the right thing to ask. By the demonstration of P, I mean a deductively valid argument, which has P for its conclusion, and such that each premise is either incorrigible, or self-evident, or evident to the senses. And you've got an argument like that for the truth of Christianity? I think some Calvin professors would be surprised to hear that. But why? The young Indian now seemed genuinely surprised himself. Are there some who are not Christians? Oh no, they're all Christians, but many of them say that there couldn't be a demonstrative argument or proof for Christianity. Nothing like what you've described. It's a matter of faith. Well, I don't know why it shouldn't be faith, Ravi said with a perplexed frown. But anyway, for better or for worse, I seem to have this demonstration. We can't do anything about that, can we? I'd be interested to hear it, Carol said, and maybe we could talk about it. Oh, by all means, but better to read it than to hear it. Ravi smiled a little apologetically as he reached for his briefcase. I'm afraid it's a little long, over 26 pages, almost 200 numbered propositions, but I've tried to make every premise explicit and make every logical move clear and simple. He pulled out a stapled typescript and handed it to Carol. She saw that the title was Christianity Demonstrated More Geometrico, and she began to read. She did not, however, read for long, not a page, nor half a page, or even a quarter of a page, for the very first premise, no more than a single line, stopped her. It read, Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead. Carol read the line again. There was no doubt of what it said, and it was clearly marked premise. She looked up, wondering if this were a joke, but Ravi seemed to be smiling in an open and sincere way. But Ravi, this premise, she pointed to it on the page. Guptar looked at the page, now a little puzzled again. Jesus rose from the dead? But that's true, isn't it? That's how I began the journey to Christ. But she said, of course you can get an argument for Christianity if you start with the premise like that, but it's not a demonstration. This premise isn't, it's not I see, said Ravi, smiling easily again. You think this premise is true, but not suitable for a demonstration. What do you think is wrong with it? Well, she said, the premises are supposed to be either incorrigible, that is obviously true, or self-evident, that is logically true or evident to the senses, meaning I can tell if they're true by looking. But this one is. And then she stopped. She stopped because it suddenly occurred to her that maybe Ravi was going to say that the resurrection was evident to the senses, that people had actually seen Jesus alive after his death and burial. Of course, she hadn't seen him, but she couldn't deny, since she was a Christian, that someone had seen him. Or on the other hand, maybe it shouldn't count. But why not? Why should her situation be more definitive than the experience of, say, Mary Magdalene? Mary Magdalene, of course, was one of the first people to see Jesus after he allegedly rose from the dead. So maybe the premise did satisfy the requirements after all. Or should the notion of a demonstration be relativized so that this argument might be a demonstration to some people, but not to others? Those questions rose quickly in Carol's mind, and she had no time to sort them out. So she went ahead with what she had first intended to say. This first premise isn't incorrigible, that is, it isn't obviously true, or self-evident, that is, it isn't logically true, or evident to the senses, because we didn't see Jesus rise from the dead. So the argument can't be a demonstration. But it is, said the Indian quietly. I'm sure of it. It's what? She asked. It's self-evident that Jesus rose from the dead. For a moment, Carol simply stared at Ravi, her mouth dropping open. But she got herself together enough to speak. Self-evident? But how could it be? How could the resurrection possibly be self-evident? Why shouldn't it be? The man responded. He paused a moment and then went on. Look, Carol, you asked me what I meant by a demonstration. Now let me ask you, how do you understand the concept of self-evidence? Well, she said, the way it was explained in our epistemology class, remember epistemology is the study of knowledge and how we know. A proposition is self-evident if you just understand, one more time. A proposition is self-evident if just understanding it is enough to make you believe it. You couldn't understand it without believing it. So looking at our apples again, if you understand that 2 apples and 3 apples are 5 apples, then it's self-evident. You just need to follow the logical steps to see how it's true. Fine, he smiled at her. A splendid definition. That's just what I mean about the resurrection. So you couldn't understand it without believing it. That's just what I mean about the resurrection, he says. It can't be, Carol said. The self-evident truths are necessary propositions like 2 plus 1 equals 3 and all bachelors are unmarried, because of course it's part of the definition of bachelor that he's an unmarried man. You can't have a married bachelor, it's impossible. But the resurrection is an historical fact, it's not a necessary truth. Of course the resurrection is an historical fact, Carol, and it's not a necessary truth. You're certainly right about that. But why should that prevent it from being self-evident? Why should we suppose that all the self-evident truths are necessary truths? For example, 2 plus 3 equals 5 is a necessary truth. It has to be that way. But we could imagine a parallel universe where Jesus did not rise from the dead, or maybe we can't. It depends on who we are. But yes, why should we suppose that all the self-evident truths are necessary truths? What else should they be? Some of them could be contingent truths, meaning they depend on certain situations. We just have to look and see. Like, there's no situation where 2 plus 3 does not equal 5. We just can't imagine a scenario where that would be the case because it's just impossible, right? So it's a necessary truth. Oh, and my doorbell is ringing, so excuse me 1 second. I'll be right there. I'm so sorry. All right, so I'm back. Apologies for the interruptions, but I do hope the quality of this recording is better. That's the most important thing for me. So let me just reread that last part. Of course the resurrection is an historical fact, Carol, and it's not a necessary truth. You're certainly right about that. But why should that prevent it from being self-evident? Why should we suppose that all the self-evident truths are necessary truths? What else could they be? Some of them could be contingent truths. We just have to look and see. Ravi squirmed against his seatbelt, trying to turn. The definition you gave is basically psychological. It defines the notion of self-evidence in terms of the way in which something can be believed or not believed. Many philosophers have thought that there was an important class of propositions which satisfied that definition. I think they were right about that, but some of these philosophers may also have thought that all self-evident truths were also necessary truths, and on that I think they are mistaken. At the very least, we should ask whether there is some argument which connects the logical notion of necessity with the psychological feature of self-evidence. Do you know of such an argument? As a matter of fact, Carol could not think of any such argument, and so she turned to another problem. Aren't there a lot of people who understand the claim that Jesus rose from the dead but don't believe it? There certainly seem to be, Ravi said. I don't want to deny it. But here I use a distinction, which I was glad to find in St. Thomas, between what is simply self-evident and what is self-evident to someone. Incidentally, I like how he says St. Thomas here. I'm sure he's talking about St. Thomas Aquinas, but you might also know the story, right? After Jesus rose from the dead, and the apostle St. Thomas, a different St. Thomas, who was one of Jesus's companions, refused to believe it, right? He said, I don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead unless I put my hand into the holes in his hands, my fingers into the holes in his hands, right, from the crucifixion. I will not believe it. So St. Thomas the apostle understood that the statement Jesus has risen from the dead, but he did not believe it, right? Well, he came to believe it later on when he actually saw Jesus and did exactly. There's that famous painting by Caravaggio. In fact, let me find it and I will share it with you. And here it is. It's The Incredulity of St. Thomas, painted by Caravaggio in the year 1602. The Wikipedia page just mentions that it shows the episode which gave rise to the term Doubting Thomas, which, formerly known as the Incredulity of Thomas, had frequently been represented in Christian art since at least the 5th century, which I will actually have to look into that because I'd love to see some other paintings. According to the Gospel of John, Thomas the Apostle missed one of Jesus' appearances to the apostles after his resurrection and said, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails are and put my hand into his side. Jesus' body had been pierced by a Roman spear after he had died while he was still on the cross. I will not believe it. A week later, Jesus appeared and told Thomas to touch him and stop doubting. And Jesus said, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. And let's have a closer look at the picture there. It's a rather, is graphic the right word, but it doesn't, mince the fact that Thomas wanted to literally probe Jesus to make sure he was really, really alive again. So I've always liked this painting. It's very striking. Anyway, let's get back to our story. So St. Thomas understood that Jesus rose from the dead, but didn't believe it until he, had the evidence of his senses that he was looking for. The resurrection is self-evident to me, and maybe to some people like me. I'm somebody who has to believe that doctrine as soon as I understand it. It's like he's compelled to believe that Jesus rose from the dead the second he understands that Jesus rose from the dead, and so on. But for those other people, it's just not self-evident. They will all have to proceed some other way to faith. Carol now found herself with a variety of questions leading in different directions. One involved a conjecture, and she decided to begin with that one. Is there anything you believe, Ravi, that you don't take to be self-evident? Oh, sure, he said. I don't by any means take all my beliefs to be self-evident. The existence of God, for example. I believe it, certainly, but it's not self-evident to me. When I first believed in Jesus' resurrection, I started to read the Bible and other Christian writings. Of course, I found a lot about God in them, but it was almost a year before I believed that there was a God, and then it was because I had worked out the first part of my argument, and it still doesn't seem at all self-evident to me. But then why do you think the resurrection is self-evident? 2 reasons. One is introspective. When I try to sort out the structure of my own intellectual life from the inside, my belief in the resurrection seems to be self-evident. It has that feel about it. It seems to me that I simply could not fail to believe it if I knew that it was there to be believed. I just seem to recognize that disposition as part of my own intellectual machinery, my cognitive set. The other reason is historical. I actually did believe this doctrine as soon as I heard it. The very first time I heard the resurrection mentioned, I didn't know what the word resurrection meant. I asked the teacher to explain it, and as soon as he did, I found myself believing the doctrine. I really was surprised, but there was nothing I could do about it. I was struck with that belief, and I have been ever since. But at least you had the testimony of your teacher to go on, Carol said. Not at all. The man who explained the resurrection to me was a lapsed Hindu teaching comparative religion. He's a westernized naturalist with no sympathy at all for Christianity. I was a firm believer in the resurrection before I ever met a Christian or read a line of Christian literature. Carol shook her head. That's incredible. It's so different from anything I've ever heard. I just can't believe it. How could you possibly have mental machinery like that? Where could you have gotten it? But that's an easy question, isn't it, Carol? At least it seems to be to me. I've got no doubt that God gave me that disposition to believe in the resurrection. It was His way of drawing me to Christ. And why not? Surely that's not beyond God's power. If He can give me a disposition to believe my senses, He can also give me a disposition to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. But there's a difference, Ravi. Practically all of us believe our senses, but almost nobody, not even Christians, believes the resurrection the way you do. Surely that difference is important? There certainly is that difference, the Indian replied, but its importance is more obscure. If you're asking about why there is that difference, I don't have any special theory about it. There are lots of differences among people. Some people have good eyesight, some poor. Some are colorblind, some are totally blind. Some people are intelligent, some are dull. Some can run a mile in 4 minutes, some in 8 minutes, and so on. Why does God give us different gifts, different abilities? I don't know, but I can thank God for what He gave me and go ahead to use it as well as I can. And other people can use what He gives to them. Guptar paused, but Carol said nothing, so he went on. But maybe you really had a different question. Maybe you think that a disposition which almost everyone has is somehow better than a disposition which only a few people have. But just how is it better? Is the more widespread disposition supposed to be more reliable? In my disposition, even if I'm the only one to have it, is a disposition to believe a particular proposition. And that proposition is, well, what do you think about it, Carol? What do you say about the resurrection? Well, I think it's true, of course, she said. Naturally, I'm a Christian, but I don't think it's self-evident. No, Ravi said, but you think it's true. And so you also have to think that my disposition to believe it is reliable. In fact, it's 100% reliable. Nothing can be more reliable than that. That can't be the way in which my disposition falls short. Or do you think that in general the dispositions which God gives to a few people are less reliable than those He gives to many people? Maybe you believe that, but I don't. I don't see any reason to believe that God is more likely to deceive one person than two. At this point, Carol decided to try another tack. Let's go back to the definition of self-evidence. Couldn't someone offer a different definition, maybe entirely in terms of logical necessity, or at least one which made logical necessity a necessary condition for self-evidence? I suppose they could, said Ravi, and on a definition like that, the resurrection would not be self-evident, and my argument would not be a demonstration. But so far, it's just a matter of terminology. The real question is whether the new definition is better than the old. Does it pick out a class with some important feature, a class which the other definition ignores? Well, doesn't it? Carol asked. Necessary truth is an important property, I should think. No doubt it is, but is it important here? It sure seems like it. There could be a proposition which you can't stop believing, but which is false nevertheless. Like, that's possible. You could imagine a proposition which he can't help believing, but is wrong. Like, well, okay, I'll think of a good example a bit later, and I'll share it a bit later. But adding necessity to the definition of self-evidence will guarantee what is self-evident is also true. Ravi smiled. Of course it will do that. Okay, a good example would be somebody who thinks something is their destiny, like to become a famous writer or to become a famous actor, and they believe it's true. Like they just feel it, and yet maybe it's not meant to be. Maybe they try, but they never make it, right? So in that particular case, that would be a proposition they couldn't help believing, but was ultimately false. So, okay, sorry, my brain kind of got stuck on that, and I had to share it. Ravi smiled. Of course, it will do that. But we cannot make ourselves infallible or even more learned by altering a definition. It's harder than that. I don't understand what you mean. Well, look at it this way. All of the necessary truths are true, so we build a requirement of necessary truth into the concept of self-evidence. Let's look at it this way. All of the necessary truths are true, so if we build a requirement of necessary truth into the concept of self-evidence, then all self-evident truths will be true. But all of the contingent truths are true too. So if we build contingent truth into self-evidence, then again self-evidence will guarantee truth. Contingent truth will do that job just as well as necessary truth. So if something is contingently true or absolutely self-evidently a true, it's still going to be true. But in either case, we will still be exposed to all the same substantive mistakes as before. We will just have different names for them. Instead of saying that a self-evident belief was false, we will say that a belief thought to be self-evident was not really so. But the substance of the mistake will be the same. The real question is whether something we can't help believing is false. If so, then we are just stuck with that false belief, and there's nothing we can do about it. No reshuffling of our terminology will help us there. Well, said Carol, with a doubtful expression on her face, that sounds right. But somehow I always thought that necessary truths were more solid than contingent truths. But let's let that go for now. You've got this argument you say is a demonstration. But what good is it if it has to start with something like the resurrection? Isn't that what all this is about? I think that that is important. Maybe the most important question, Ravi said. One more time. I think that is important. Maybe the most important question, Ravi said. But at the very least, my argument was good for me. It led me to Christ. And if there is someone with the same disposition which I have, it may help them in the same way. And if there are people with somewhat different dispositions, but in the same ballpark, as you Americans say, then my argument might give them a clue as to how to construct their own arguments. But most people aren't like that, are they? No, probably not. And so my argument is not as good as the best imaginable argument. An argument which began with premises which are self-evident to everybody. That would be something, wouldn't it? I wish I could invent one like that. But I can't, or at least so far I haven't. You've got the best I've been able to do right here. It's not everything. All I claim is that it's something. It's a rigorous demonstration of the truth of Christianity. It's not a universal conversion machine. The stewardess was standing beside them in the aisle now, holding 2 dinner trays. Carol slid the manuscript from the tray table into her lap and picked up the napkin. Okay, she said. Okay, maybe you're right. Anyway, let's eat. Then I'll read the rest of it. And to herself she thought, maybe it wouldn't have been any stranger talking to the girl. I hope you enjoyed that story, and I look forward to our discussion.